Hey guys, this is a video that I've been wanting to do for a while now. What I'm going to do is go through the entire Beach Boys discography from the beginning, and I'm going to score each album on this tier list, with S being the highest and E being the lowest. I look forward to your guys' feedback, seeing where we agree, where we disagree. And yeah, this is going to take a while, so I'm just going to jump right into it. For the first album, we have Surfin' Safari, and I'm going to give this one a B. This is a good album. It's not my favorite of the early stuff, but it definitely is a solid first release for them to put out there. They're very clearly establishing their sound and establishing a couple of different themes that they plan on going off of with a lot of their songs moving forward. And obviously, one of the main themes is surfing, given the title of the album and what a lot of people think of when they think of Beach Boys. Obviously, they think of surfing. But then you get other things that are kind of more general to just living in California at that time. So, you get songs about driving cars, drinking root beer, going to fairs, it's summertime. So you get a very clear depiction of, being in California and it's sunny out and people are at the beach. And if you like that era of the Beach Boys and that's the sound that you like most, you'll definitely be into this album. I do think there are better earlier albums that are also in the same category as this, but this is a solid first release for them, and I would give this one a B. For the next album, we have Surfin' USA, and I'm also going to give this one a B. This is a good album. I like it probably slightly more than Surfin' Safari, but not enough to bump it up into an A category. Once again, very heavy on the surf rock sound. And obviously, this album has the song Surfin' USA, which has been a huge song for kind of creating an idea in people's heads of what the Beach Boys sound like. I feel like a lot of people, when they think of the Beach Boys, that's the song that they think about. And that's done a lot to kind of depict them as being a band that only does surf music and stuff like that, which obviously we know is not true once we get into future albums. But one thing that I really do like on this album is the song Lonely Sea. And I think this is one of the first early Beach Boys songs where you hear Brian's writing start to get a little bit more intricate. He's starting to get a little bit more interesting chords going on. You just start to hear a little bit more of that unique Brian Wilson sound that we all know and love start to come into fruition on that song. And I would say that as these albums go on, that starts to become more and more apparent. So that's another thing I really like from this album. But once again, I don't think it's enough to bump it up into an A. But if you like Surfin' Safari, you'll definitely love this album. You might like it a little bit more. And yeah, this one also gets a B. The next album is Surfer Girl, and I'm going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album. I think it has one incredible song after another. And now that they've established their sound and some of their themes with the first two albums, they're able to kind of continue off of some of that stuff, but also experiment a little more and stretch their sound a little bit wider than they had on previous albums. And you can hear that Brian's sense of harmony is definitely starting to expand more, so you're getting more interesting chord progressions on a lot of the songs. And you're also starting to hear the influence of the Four Freshmen become much more prevalent, so a lot of those vocal harmonies are becoming much jazzier. And I would say a couple different songs that are good examples of both of these things would be Surfer Girl, The Surfer Moon, In My Room, and Your Summer Dream. But yeah, this is an amazing album, a very important album for the evolution of the Beach Boys. And yeah, this gets an S easily. Next, we have Little Deuce Coupe, and I'm going to give this one a B. I almost gave it a C, but I thought about it for a bit, and there are two things that are redeeming about this album. But I do have to say, this is probably my least favorite of their early surf rock stuff. Mostly just because I'm not into cars at all, and there's so many songs on this album about cars, so it's just kind of hard to get into that for me. But there are two songs that do redeem this album for me. The first one is Be True to Your School. I just always thought that was a really solid song. And the second song is called A Young Man Is Gone, and this is the first song on any of their albums to be all a cappella. And I always love when they do that. I always wished that they had an all a cappella album, because just hearing it on its own, it's such a beautiful sound, and it's so massive, and it just makes you realize how big of a part of the Beach Boys sound those vocal harmonies are. So definitely happy to see that be introduced on this album. And yeah, this is going to get a B. Next, we have Shutdown Volume 2, and I'm going to give this one an S. This is another incredible album from their early period. And I would have similar things to say about this that I did about Surfer Girl. Once again, you're starting to hear Brian's sense of harmony expand more and more. more interesting chord progressions getting introduced. You hear this on songs like Don't Worry Baby, The Warmth of the Sun, Keep an Eye on Summer, and you're still maintaining that general kind of California surf type sound, but doing it in a way where you're starting to, once again, experiment a little bit more in the writing process, introduce more interesting chords, more interesting vocal harmonies. And yeah, you're just starting to hear the Beach Boys evolve more and more. And I would say Shutdown Volume 2 and Surfer Girl are my two favorites from their early period. So yeah, this one is going to get an S. So as I was going through these albums, I tried to pinpoint when I felt like the Beach Boys had entered a new phase. And the first phase that I had come up with was from Surfin' Safari up until All Summer Long. So I would regard this album as the conclusion of the first phase of the Beach Boys. This is the introductory phase where they established that California surf rock sound very heavily on the first two albums. And then I would say in the remaining four albums, you're getting more experimentation starting to happen, more intricate harmonies being incorporated, but it's all being done under this California surf rock theme that they've kind of used as their framework up until now. And I would say that this album, All Summer Long, is the conclusion of this first phase of the Beach Boys. And this album is going to be getting an A. If there was something in between A and S, that would be perfect for this, because I really do love this album, but I don't love it as much as Surfer Girl and Shutdown Volume 2. And I would have similar things to say about this album that I said about those previous two. The sound is continuing to evolve. Brian is continuing to experiment with different harmonies, very interesting harmonies on songs like All Summer Long and Girls on the Beach. Girls on the Beach is really interesting because when you listen to it, it doesn't sound that intricate when you're listening to the chord changes and stuff, but when it switches to the chorus, it does all these crazy like half-step modulations. Definitely recommend listening to the song Girls on the Beach. That's a wild song. And obviously you have I Get Around. There's some crazy vocal stuff going on in that song. I recommend listening to the a cappella version if you haven't yet. But yeah, I love this album. I think it's a great way to conclude the first phase of the Beach Boys, and it's going to get an A. So now we've entered the second phase of the Beach Boys, and I would say the big difference here is that most of the experimentation that we were hearing within the first 6 albums was pretty much done under the framework of that California surfing theme that a lot of people know them for. And I would say that in these next handful of albums, you're going to continue to see them break out of those themes more and more and more, and Brian's genius is going to continue to keep sneaking into these albums until it finally culminates into this huge blowout of an album, which we'll get to. But I would say that it starts here at the Christmas album. This one is going to get an S, easily. This album is just absolutely amazing. Probably my favorite Christmas album of all time. And it's so good that, I could listen to it any time of year and it doesn't feel weird to me at all. The first side has 5 amazing original Christmas songs that Brian wrote. And obviously the one that everybody knows and loves is Little Saint Nick, which is actually the first song that Al Jardine did lead vocals for, which is really awesome. The remainder of the album has traditional Christmas songs that have these amazing big band arrangements by a guy named Dick Reynolds, who was an arranger for the Four Freshmen. And the combination of the amazing originals that Brian wrote, the tasteful vocal harmonies, and these exotic big band arrangements culminate into one of the best Christmas albums of all time, in my opinion. So this one easily gets an S. Next, we have the Beach Boys Today, and this one is also going to get an S. I have 2 favorite Beach Boys albums that are tied together. This is one of them. You'll find out what the other one is in a little bit. But yeah, I think this album is incredible. A lot of people will say that Pet Sounds was Brian at his creative peak, but I would actually argue that a lot of that started on this album, particularly on the second side. I think the second side of this is one of the greatest sides of an album I've ever heard. Songs like Please Let Me Wonder, Kiss Me Baby, She Knows Me Too Well, and In the Back of My Mind. And then on the first side, we have incredible songs like Good to My Baby, When I Grow Up to Be a Man, Help Me Rhonda. So the fact that Brian was able to write so many incredible, interesting songs for this one album tells me that Brian is really starting to get going now. His creativity is really starting to shine, and we're about to enter his creative peak in the coming years. So yeah, I absolutely love this album. Easily give it an S. Next, we have Summer Days and Summer Nights, and I'm going to give this one an A. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be surprised that I didn't give this one an S, because typically A lot of Beach Boys fans will say that this is one of their best albums, and a lot of times people compare this to the Beach Boys today, and I definitely prefer the Beach Boys today over this album. But I do love this album. There's a lot of different things going on. The first side is much more upbeat, much more of that kind of surf rock vibe, and then you get this one song called Girl Don't Tell Me, which is a very interesting sound for the Beach Boys. It almost reminds me of the Beatles in their Rubber Soul period. And I know these albums were only released a few months apart, so this was actually before Rubber Soul, so I haven't done a lot of research into that, but I'd be curious if anybody in the Beatles was actually inspired by that song. And then on the second side, we get a lot of amazing stuff. You start out with California Girls, which is obviously a huge song. And then you go to this song called Let 'Em Run Wild, which is one of my favorite lesser-known Beach Boys songs, probably in my top 3 favorites of theirs. So I would highly recommend checking out that song if you've never heard it. And then you get a few more songs. There's a cool instrumental called Summer Means New Love, which Brian ended up redoing on his album No Peer Pressure. He added some lyrics to it and he made it into a song called Somewhere Quiet, which is really cool. Very interesting chords on the bridge of that song. And the album ends with a beautiful a cappella song called And Your Dream Comes True. Probably my favorite a cappella recording of the Beach Boys, so I would recommend checking that one out as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I really like this album. I would give this one an A. The next album is Beach Boys Party. I'm going to give this one a B. This album is pretty good. It never did much for me because it's mostly covers and it's an acoustic album, which are two things that I don't typically look for when I'm listening to the Beach Boys. And they execute everything fine on this album. The performances are great. It's just more of a stylistic preference on my part. It's just not a style that I'm really curious to hear the Beach Boys doing. And I think also because this is the album right before Pet Sounds, I have very high expectations at this point after hearing the Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights. So that's probably another reason why I'm giving it a B. But my two favorite songs on this album are probably Alley Oop and then the Bob Dylan cover, The Times They Are A-Changin'. But yeah, give that one a B. And now we are getting to the second of my two favorite Beach Boys albums, Pet Sounds. Yeah, surprise, surprise, I know. This one is getting an S, obviously. And I think most people agree that this is Brian completely at his creative peak. And I really don't know what to say that hasn't already been said about this album. Most people regard this as one of the greatest albums of all time. And I used to kind of steer away from this album because I thought it was cliche to talk about how great Pet Sounds is. But, you know, I think a lot of people say it because there is a lot of truth to it. This is a very groundbreaking album, very experimental for the time it was written. And Brian is really at his creative peak, just experimenting with so many different types of orchestrations of different instruments, starting to incorporate exotic instruments like the theremin. Brian's sense of harmony is getting very complex. Very interesting use of slash chords on songs like Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, God Only Knows, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, Caroline No. And he was using a lot of these slash chords on previous albums, but now he's getting way more experimental with his placement of these chords. And he's not afraid to mess around with some dissonant sounding harmonies. And a lot of times there might be a dissonant harmony going on, but because of the way he's orchestrating it against the rest of the band, it sounds amazing together. And you can hear a lot of these slash chords and these dissonant harmonies that I'm talking about in songs like Let's Go Away for a While or Here Today, which has a whole instrumental middle section that has these really interesting bass notes in the bottom. My favorite song on this album is probably I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. That song just gets better and better the more I listen to it. And I also love God Only Knows, Caroline No, Wouldn't It Be Nice, Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder. Pretty much the whole album I love, as we all do. But yeah, obviously it goes without saying that one's going to be getting an S. Incredible album. The next album is Smiley Smile, and I'm going to give this a B. This was a tricky one. If you know the history of this album, you know it was originally supposed to be released as just Smile. 66 was a big year for music because you had the Beach Boys release Pet Sounds, and the Beatles also released Revolver, so now there was like a ton of anticipation for both of their follow-up albums in 67. The Beach Boys were working on Smile, and the Beatles were working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and at a certain point the pressure just became too much for Brian, and he actually had a nervous breakdown and never ended up releasing the Smile album. They decided to release Smiley Smile, which basically consisted of portions of songs that were supposed to be on the Smile album, and then a handful of other songs that weren't. But I do like a lot of the songs on this album. But the reason why I said this is a tricky one is because all of my favorite songs on this are also on the Smile album. And I definitely prefer to listen to them in that context because I think Smile is much more cohesive as a full album as opposed to Smiley Smile. I feel like this album is a little bit more random and kind of sounds like it was just thrown together just so they had something to release in place of Smile. Um, but regardless, I still don't think it's a bad album for what it is. I think it is a pretty good album, and yeah, I'll give it a B. Alright, next we get to Wild Honey, and I'm going to give this an A. This is a very solid album, and I would say that this is the start of their third phase. So, in this phase, I would say each member of the band is starting to have a lot more input in the songwriting process, and you're also getting the addition of Bruce Johnston into the band as well, which adds a nice touch for sure. This album showcases a lot of that R&B and Motown influence that they were getting into with songs like I Was Made to Love Her and Darlin'. And then you still get some of those more artsy Brian Wilson songs too, like Aren't You Glad, Country Air, and Let the Wind Blow. I think as an album that follows up Smiley Smile, they did do a great job of expanding their sound a bit while still maintaining that experimental side that we started seeing more and more in the previous 2 years. So I would say this is a very good album, and this gets an A. Next, we have Friends, and I'm going to give this an S. I love this album. It's probably my favorite from their third phase. It's a fairly short album, but I think it has a great flow from start to finish, and it has a really good balance of everyone in the band contributing to the songwriting process. You can tell that they were getting more and more influenced by the hippie movement of the late 60s, and I think that had a very positive effect on their sound. I love the way the album starts with the intro track Meant for You, and then it's just one great song after another from there. Dennis Wilson's writing and singing is also starting to get showcased more with songs like Little Bird and Be Still. Be Still might be my favorite song on the album, either that or Friends. It's a kind of a tie, but very beautiful song, and one of those songs, like I said, where you can really start hearing the influence of the late 60s hippie movement more and more in their sound. But yeah, this is one of my favorites of the Beach Boys. This one easily gets an S. Next, we have 2020, and I'm going to give this an S. I also love this album. This is probably my second favorite from their third phase. The first side has a nice balance of straight ahead rock songs mixed in with a couple of really pretty ballads. The ballads are Be With Me, which is another great one written by Dennis Wilson. I really like the fact that Dennis's writing is starting to get showcased more in these albums because I always love everything that he writes. And then you also have the beautiful instrumental song The Nearest Faraway Place, which is the first song written by Bruce Johnston. I really love that song, and I think it adds a really nice touch to the album. It's a perfect way to end the first side. And then on the second side, you get some amazing Brian Wilson songs like I Went to Sleep and Time to Get Alone, which has a really nice vocal feature for Carl. And then you have a few songs that will actually later end up being a part of the Smile album, which are Cabinescence and Our Prayer. There's also a track written by Charles Manson on here, believe it or not. Apparently, in the summer of '68, the Manson family had become friends with Dennis, and they were living with him at one point. And, you know, as some people might know, Charles Manson was a songwriter, so he showed Dennis some of the stuff that he wrote, and apparently Dennis took one of his songs and altered it slightly for the album, and that song is Never Learn Not to Love, which I always thought was a really pretty song. It actually surprised me when I found out Charles Manson wrote it. But yeah, there's a lot of different interesting things going on at once, and I think it all balances out perfectly. I've always loved this album, and it easily gets an S. Next, we have Sunflower, and I'm going to give this one an A. This is another very solid album with a lot of diversity in the songwriting. This is probably the most songs Dennis has written on an album up to this point. He wrote or contributed to writing on Slip On Through, Got to Know the Woman, It's About Time, and Forever. Forever is arguably Dennis's most famous song that he's written for the Beach Boys. I mean, such a beautiful song, easily one of my favorite songs on the album. And you're also getting a couple more Bruce Johnston tracks as well, with Deirdre and Tears in the Morning. And then you also have a couple of amazing Brian Wilson tracks like This Whole World, All I Want to Do, and Cool Cool Water, which is a very pretty mellow track, a really nice way to wrap up the album. So I would say this is another very solid album from their 70s period, and this one gets an A. Alright, next we have Surf's Up, and I'm also going to give this one an A. This is another very good album. I feel like they've been on a roll for these past 5 albums. Everything has either been an A or an S. The first side starts out with Don't Go Near the Water, which is a very cool song, and I was really surprised when I found out that it was written by Mike Love and Al Jardine. I always thought that was a Brian song, especially when you listen to that piano part at the very beginning. It has a really wacky, interesting sound to it if you listen closely. It definitely sounded like something Brian would write, but very cool song. And then you get two really solid rocking songs with Long Promised Road and Take a Load Off Your Feet. And then you have a very beautiful ballad called Disney Girls, which is another song written by Bruce Johnston. And I think that song ties the first side together perfectly. The second side starts out with Feel Flows, which is a nice laid back song written by Carl and Jack Riley, who was the band's newly appointed manager at that time. And then you get a song written by Al Jardine called Looking at Tomorrow. And then the album wraps up with 3 amazing Brian Wilson songs, the last 2 ending on more of a darker note. First, you have A Day in the Life of a Tree, and then the 2 darker ones are Till I Die and Surf's Up, which are both definitely some of my favorite songs that Brian has ever written, especially Surf's Up. That's just such a classic. But yeah, I think this is another great 70s album from the Beach Boys, and this one gets an A. Next, we have Carl and the Passions, So Tough, and I'm going to give this one an A. I really like this one. This is the first of 2 albums to feature Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fataar from The Flames. I think their addition adds a really nice touch to the sound, and you're still getting Jack Riley in the mix as well. It starts out with a really cool song written by Brian and Jack Riley called You Need a Mess of Help to Stand Alone, which is definitely one of my favorite songs on the album. And then the remainder of the first side kind of maintains more of a driving, rocking vibe with the songs Here She Comes, written by Ricky Fataar and Blondie Chaplin, and Marcella, written by Brian and Jack Riley. And then you also have He Come Down, which is kind of a mix between rocking and mellow at the same time. The second side starts out with a really pretty Ricky Fataar Blondie Chaplin song called Hold On Dear Brother, which actually uses an odd time signature, which is a little fun fact. The main groove is a bar of 5/4 and a bar of 6/4 repeated, which is really unique to hear in the Beach Boys. The only other example I could think of up to this point where they use an odd time signature is in the ending section of Busy Doing Nothing off of Friends, which has a little section that's in 7. And then the second side also has 2 awesome Dennis Wilson songs called Make It Good and Cuddle Up, and these songs definitely have a similar vibe to his solo album Pacific Ocean Blue, which is an amazing album. I'd highly recommend it if you haven't heard it. And obviously I can't forget to mention All This Is That, which is an absolutely incredible song, probably my favorite song on the album. But yeah, this is another great 70s album. They've been on fire for these past 6 albums, so this one is also getting an A. Alright, next we have Holland, which is the second album to feature Ricky Fataar and Blondie Chaplin, and I'm going to give this a B. I like this album, but I do like Carl and the Passions more, so I would feel weird giving both of them an A. If there was a score in between A and B, it would be perfect for this because this is probably my favorite of everything up in the B category so far. I like how the album opens up with Sail on Sailor, which is Blondie Chaplin's big feature. It's got a really nice drive to it and really brings the listener in. And then you get a pretty ballad written by Dennis entitled Steamboat. The first side ends with a song called California Saga that's divided up into 3 parts, and it creates the feeling that this might be a concept album, but I'm not entirely sure if it is or not, and I couldn't find a lot of info on it, so if you know anything about that, please let me know. But it definitely seems to be centered around the theme of like sailing away from some place and being out in the water. Those themes seem to pop up in almost every song. And then on the second side, you have The Traitor, which is a really beautiful song, and then you have Leaving This Town, Only With You, and Funky Pretty, so you're getting songs written by almost everyone on the second side. Then the album wraps up with 6 shorter songs that have voiceovers by Jack Riley, and it tells a story about a prince who gets visited in the middle of the night by a piper who takes his old radio and he turns it into a magic transistor, and apparently he does this for a lot of people. So very bizarre, very random story. I like the way that they tell the story, but I'm not sure what the relevance is with the other songs in the album, which is why it's hard for me to tell if it's a concept album or not, because like I said, you're getting all these other songs about sailing and being out on the water, and then it wraps up with these 6 songs that seem to take just a very random turn, and I'm not sure how it's all supposed to connect together, but maybe there's something that I'm missing, and if I am, please let me know, because I've been very curious about this album for a long time. But I do think it is a solid album for what it is, and yeah, I'll give it a B. Now we get to 15 Big Ones, and I would consider this to be the start of the 4th phase of the Beach Boys, which is unfortunately my least favorite of their phases. To me, the biggest difference from this point on would be the shift in the songwriting style, not as much experimentation, and also the sound of the production is shifting over to a much more overly processed, sort of cheesy 80s type of mix. And I don't necessarily think it's a fault of the Beach Boys. I think it's more just a product of the times that these albums were made in, because I think the majority of albums from the late 70s and the 80s were all adjusting to this new mode of production. So for 15 Big Ones, I'm going to give it a C. It's mostly covers with a few originals thrown in there, and the originals are the main thing that redeem it for me. I don't care for really any of the covers that they do, but there are a couple of originals that I do like on here, like Headphonia and TM Song. But overall, I don't care for it as an album very much, and I think it's their worst album up to this point. So yeah, this is going to get a C. Next, we have the Beach Boys' Love You, and I'm going to give this one an A. I really love this album, and this is an interesting one. I wouldn't consider this one to be part of the 4th phase. I would sort of say it's in like a category of its own, similar to Smiley Smile. Mostly because it's the last album that Brian produced and wrote almost every song for, and I think he did an amazing job. It's nice to hear him experimenting with the new technologies that were available at the time. He's utilizing a lot of new synthesizer sounds, and his writing style is working really well with the new sounds that he has at his disposal. I really enjoy almost every song on the album, but my 2 favorites are Solar System and The Night Was So Young. This also has one of my favorite album covers of all time. It just looks so cool. It kind of looks like an Etch-a-Sketch with really psychedelic colors over it. I don't know why, but I always thought that this cover would look awesome as a pillow. So if you're listening and you like making pillows, I would suggest trying that out. I think it would look really cool. But I would say that this is unfortunately the last good Beach Boys album for a while, but it is really nice to see Brian in the driver's seat one last time. And yeah, this gets an A. Alright, for the next few albums, I'm going to have a lot of similar things to say about all of them, so these are going to go by a little bit quicker. The next one is MIU album, and I'm going to give this one a C. This is probably my least favorite up to this point. The vibe and the production changes significantly from the previous album. It might have a couple individual songs here and there that I like Sweet Sunday Kinda Love, but I really don't care for the majority of the songs, and I don't care for it as an album. I've always had a hard time getting into it. I've listened to it a few times and really tried to give it a chance, but it just doesn't do anything for me. So this isn't my favorite, but not my least favorite of what's to come. It's got, like I said, a few songs here and there that I like. So yeah, I'll give this one a C. Next, we have LA Light album, and I'm going to give this a C as well. Pretty much everything I said about the previous album applies to this. There are a couple of individual songs that I like Good Timin' and the new version of Here Comes the Night. But overall, as an album, I really don't care for it, and so yeah, this will also get a C. Alright, next we have Keepin' the Summer Alive, and this is going to be the first album to get a D. With the previous 2 albums, I didn't care for them, but they had a couple of individual songs that helped a bit. But with this one, I really don't care for any of the songs. And I've listened to it a few times, I've tried to give it a chance, but it's always just been very boring to me and sounds very formulaic and generic, and I don't care for the production. So yeah, this one's going to get a D. Next we have a self-titled album called The Beach Boys, obviously. And I'm going to give this one a C. This is similar to MIU and Light album. I don't care for it as an album, and I really don't like any of the songs with the exception of I Do Love You with Stevie Wonder. I really love that song, and that's basically the only redeeming quality for me, but it's redeeming enough to give it a C instead of a D. So yeah, we'll give this one a C. Alright, now we have Still Cruisin', and I'm actually going to give this an E. And the reason for that is because this album is barely anything more than one side of music. The first side is 5 originals, and then the second side is 1 cover, 1 original, and then they added I Get Around, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and California Girls, which I'm not sure why they did that. Obviously, there's some reason, but I haven't researched it enough. But I'm not a fan of any of the originals, and I'm only getting really half of an album's worth of new music. And I've never been a fan of Kokomo. I know some people do like that song, and that's fine, and it's understandable, but I've just never been crazy about this era of the Beach Boys. So I would say up to this point, this is my least favorite album of theirs, probably my least favorite of their entire discography. So this is the first album to get an E. Next we have Summer in Paradise, and I'm going to give this a D. I view this the same as Keepin' the Summer Alive. I don't care for any of the songs on it. My favorite part is that Van Dyke Parks is playing accordion and keyboards on some of it, but that doesn't really do enough to bump it up to a C for me because, like I said, there's no songs that I like on it. But yeah, this is another D. Next, we have Stars and Stripes Volume 1, and I'm going to give this a D. This is an album of other artists covering their songs, and for me, the Beach Boys are a band that I've never really cared to hear covers of. To me, their vocals are such an important part of their sound, and I think it's almost impossible to duplicate it with anyone else. And also, most of the covers are done in more of a country style too, which I'm not really crazy about. I've never been a huge country fan. But yeah, I've never really cared for this album either. This is another one that's going to get a D. Alright, now we get to the Smile Sessions, and this one easily gets an S. This is an absolutely incredible album, and I'm very grateful that Brian was able to revisit these tracks and put this album into existence. I would say that this is Brian's most experimental and ambitious work of his entire discography. It's just crazy to think about what other incredible albums would have been created if Brian hadn't had his breakdown during the making of this in '67. I love the lyrics that Van Dyke Parks contributes, and I always wished that him and Brian had collaborated more because Van Dyke Parks is an incredible musician and definitely has a lot of similarities to Brian in terms of experimental songwriting. I'd recommend checking out his first album, Song Cycle, if you haven't. I think it's probably the most underrated album of the '60s. Most people have never even heard of it, and it's an incredible piece of work. As far as songs go on here, you're seeing a lot of songs that were already released on previous albums or released as singles, with songs like Our Prayer, Cabin Essence, Surf's Up, Good Vibrations, and Heroes and Villains, but they were all originally written with the intent of being on the Smile album, so I like to view them in that context when I'm listening to them. I think there are a lot of people that, rave about Pet Sounds and how great it is, and of course that's true, but I think at the same time a lot of people are sleeping on this album and they don't realize how great it is, and I would put it up there right next to Pet Sounds. I think it's just as good and more experimental. So yeah, I'm very happy with this album. This one easily gets an S. And last but not least, we have That's Why God Made the Radio from 2012 when the Beach Boys got back together for a reunion tour and they made this album. I'm going to give this an A. This was a very pleasant surprise. It's their first album since Summer in Paradise in 1992, so I really had no idea what to expect given the fact that there's been a gap of 20 years in between, and also considering the fact that I didn't care for any of their work in the 80s or 90s. But for a reunion album, I would say this is pretty much as good as it can be for a band that's been around as long as the Beach Boys. For me, this checks off all the boxes that I'm looking for in a good Beach Boys album. You're getting the beautiful vocal harmonies in songs like Think About the Days, Pacific Coast Highway, and From There to Back Again. And you're even still getting some of those really weird, interesting chord progressions in songs like That's Why God Made the Radio. And then you're getting songs that bring back sort of the original surf rock kind of sound with songs like Spring Vacation and Shelter. So I thought it was a great balance. It's really giving me everything that I'm looking for as a Beach Boys fan. And I also really like the mix. It doesn't sound too overly processed like the 80s and 90s stuff. Obviously, it's way later, so it's going to sound different. But that was one thing I was worried about, and I didn't have any issues with the mix at all. And I think that the vocal work is still very solid for how old they are at this point. So I would say that between this and the Smile Sessions, I would say that that completely redeems all of the stuff from the 80s and 90s, which is great. It's great to end on a high note for them, and I think they really did with this album. So yeah, this one gets an A. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts, and if you've listened this far, I thank you. This definitely took a while, but I learned a lot in the process, and I really enjoyed making this, so maybe in the future I'll continue doing more videos like this with some other bands. But Please leave any comments. Let me know where you agree and disagree. And if I got any facts wrong for any of the albums, please feel free to correct me. There's so much information in here, so it's definitely possible that I got something wrong or let something slip here and there. But yeah, thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys at the next video.